Welcome to Florida's Cannabis News Podcast, a weekly podcast exploring the legal, political, and economic changes to Florida's cannabis industry, covering important news and events for Florida cannabis businesses and professionals. Sit back and relax. Florida's Cannabis News Podcast begins now.
Good morning and happy Friday. Today is April 5th, 2019, and you're tuned into Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. This is your host, David, and I'm here every Friday covering the latest news and events in Florida's cannabis industry. Today we have another news-filled episode, so let's dive right into this week's top stories. This week's top story comes out of Tallahassee, where the Florida House is considering a proposal that would cap THC levels in medical cannabis at 10%. Ray Rodriguez, the chair of the Health and Services Committee, said, quote, "We think there should be a cap on THC," close quote. Rodriguez shepherded medical cannabis legislation in the House since 2014, but according to Rodriguez, no bill has been filed and the legislation is still, quote, "up in the air," unquote. Rodriguez went on to say this week that it's something they still think is important, limiting the THC to 10%. To support his limitation, Rodriguez is relying on the Lancet Psychiatry Medical Journal that recently published a study linking cannabis use with psychosis, also known as psychotic disorder. According to the study, people who use cannabis daily, as well as those who use high-potency strains, may be 3 times more likely to develop psychotic disorder than someone who has never used cannabis. Just for reference, the authors of the study consider high-potency cannabis to be products with more than 10% THC, which is the intoxicating ingredient in cannabis that produces a euphoric effect. The authors also explained that to define psychosis, they mean that people who meet a diagnostic criteria to come into the attention of mental health services to receive treatment for psychosis. Examples of this are hallucination, delusion, things of that nature. Just to provide some background on the study Mr. Rodriguez is citing, the researchers identified 901 people aged 18 to 64 who were diagnosed with their first episode of psychosis between 2010 and 2015. The research was primarily conducted in Europe in cities including London, Paris, Amsterdam, Barcelona, and one site in Brazil, actually. The researchers then asked these individuals and a control group of 1,200 other people about their habits, including their use of cannabis. People in support of the findings of this research explained that the availability of high THC cannabis is a recent phenomenon. Almost 20 years ago, there wasn't much high-potency cannabis available in the United States today. Here's a myth. Today's cannabis is significantly stronger and thus more dangerous than cannabis from the past. Here are the facts. The potency of today's cannabis is only slightly higher, on average, than the cannabis from 20 or 30 years ago. What does the science say? Studies show that these increased potencies are not associated with increased health risks. Well, according to cannabis potency data compiled annually by the University of Mississippi, which has been testing samples of cannabis for THC content since the late 1970s, the average amount of THC in domestically produced cannabis is around 8%. By comparison, the University of Mississippi also reported that the average THC content in cannabis in the 80s hovered around 4.5%. Today, doctors prescribe Marinol, which is a 100% synthetic-derived THC prescription medication. These researchers didn't seem too concerned about Marinol's adverse health effects. The study has been criticized as soon as it started making waves on social media in March. Opponents explain that you cannot say cannabis causes psychosis. It's simply not supported by the data provided in this study. Many factors influence whether and how these disorders manifest. Genetics is known to play a major role. In order to show causality, one would have to follow people over time, before they started using cannabis, to then years later when they have their psychotic episodes. Opponents also explain that THC was not an isolated variable in the study Rodriguez is citing, and that's important because correlation does not mean causality. In my opinion, the findings do not provide strong support for the researcher's conclusion, but Ray Rodriguez is using them to bolster his position. The Senate does not have a version of the proposal yet, but Senator Jeff Brandes said Tuesday he believes the proposal will be merged with a bill, SB 1618, that would increase the minimum tobacco smoking age in Florida from 18 to 21. Senate President Bill Galvano, Republican out of Bradenton, said in a text on Thursday that the Senate would support imposing caps on THC levels, but, quote, would have to understand more before making a determination about what caps would be and whether they should apply only to smokable cannabis. Barry Gordon, a popular Florida physician in the cannabis space, spoke on the issue. He said, "It's not about the THC percentage. In the medical world, that's going to be a horrible slippery slope." He went on to say, "This attempt to focus on the concentration of THC in the raw flower form is once again a lack of understanding that the legislators have because they have not reached out to enough clinicians who are doing this every day to understand some of those subtleties." In addition to the University of Mississippi studies I mentioned earlier, I pulled a little research about states that have limited THC. 2 years ago, Colorado limited the amount of THC in cannabis edibles to 100 milligrams. Each serving is limited to a 10 milligram size. So other states have imposed THC limits, including recreational ones. The Health and Human Services Committee met on Wednesday to discuss the proposed bill. Ray Rodriguez is the chair of that committee. But Floridians did make their voices heard this week when they made waves on social media explaining the potential THC caps are just another example of the Republican-dominated legislature attempting to thwart the will of the voters. They also explained that Florida has the fewest cannabis choices and the highest prices in the nation. This is a point I personally do not support because there are much more limited markets out there in the United States. For example, take a look at Minnesota, where manufacturers there have to process the plants into pills and oils before they could sell them. The state has outlawed the dried plant completely, and as you know, since 2 weeks ago, we have smokable flower here in Florida. Also, don't forget about Texas, where by law, no more than 0.5% THC and no less than 10% CBD forms of cannabis are available. But the cannabis in Texas is only available to patients with intractable epilepsy, and only 3 companies are licensed to produce and distribute the plant. So when activists come around and say Florida has the most restrictive this, they have the most expensive that, just keep in mind where Florida is in the market and that states are worse off than us. An issue I do see arising is that patients will be forced to purchase potentially 2 to 3 times the amount of medicine they need to get the same medical benefits. It's almost as if the proposal taxes patients by causing them to spend more money to buy more cannabis to produce the same effects as they had before. There's a couple more reasons why the THC cap bill is just wrong. It limits the edible recommendations to 200 milligrams per day and puts further restrictions on doctors' recommendations for minors and sets back testing procedures. The voters wanted free medical cards for vets and a bill where they could add employee protections, banking changes, and greater tourist reciprocity. On Wednesday, April 3rd, reports came out that the proposed bill passed the Health and Human Services Committee. The proposal still has to go to the House floor eventually and be voted on by the entire House. Amendments can still be made to remove the 10% cap by other committees before then. Then, the bill has to go to the Senate for approval, which may even be harder to get, and then to the governor himself. So we have a long road ahead and plenty of opportunities and votes to stop it before it becomes law. I don't think Governor DeSantis would let this law set us back as far as it would back to 2014, the low THC days. Everybody has been reporting on this story this week, but head on over to Dara Cam's story on creativeloathingtampa.com for more quotes and more details. This week's second top story comes out of Quincy, where state health officials agreed to allow Trulieve, Florida's largest MMTC, to open more dispensaries than state law allows. So before we get in this story, let's set the stage. When Rick Scott rolled out our medical cannabis program, Amendment 2 in 2017, he imposed a cap of 25 dispensaries for each operator. So if you had a license, you could open 25 retail locations. This number gradually increased as the number of qualified patients increased. So last week, when we hit 200,000 patients, last week we hit 200,000 patients, each MMTC gained the right to open 5 more dispensary locations. For every 100,000 patients we hit, each MMTC gets 5 more locations. The amendment, as approved by the voters, however, said nothing about any of that. There's nothing in the Florida Constitution that creates such a limit. The way Rick Scott rolled out the amendment naturally created tension in the source of not only the Trulieve lawsuit, but other ongoing legal battles. So, Trulieve, in the summer of 2017, filed an initial civil complaint calling the cap on dispensary locations arbitrary. The lawsuit argued the statutes are unfair to licensees that submitted business plans before the law changed. The cap on dispensaries expires April 1st, 2020, and has the sole purpose of suppressing competition among the treatment centers, the lawsuit contends. Furthermore, the caps on retail locations was added way after the state awarded licenses to applicants that already submitted business plans and how they were going to deploy retail locations across the state of Florida. Kim Rivers, CEO of Trulieve, spoke about the lawsuit, saying that the restrictions force us to use extremely expensive long-distance delivery and build dispensaries on a model based on geographic distribution, not where patients live. This not only restricts access to patients in need, but forces us to charge higher prices. The initial lawsuit asked the court to let Trulieve keep the dispensary locations that have already been approved and applied for before the 2017 statute was enacted under its dispensing organization license, and to be allowed to establish 25 more dispensaries under its treatment center license. The company contended that had it known the cap was going to be imposed, Trulieve would have expanded in a different manner. The Department of Health responded and said that the temporary cap was designed to give state and local officials more time to consider regulations for MMTCs. In 2018, the case went in front of Judge Karen Gievers, who's in the Second Circuit Court. Judge Gievers rejected a lot of the Department of Health's arguments. So, for example, the Department of Health's argument that the temporary cap was designed to give state and local officials more time, she explained that there's no need for more time. The legislator enacted the state's first medical cannabis law in 2014. It's now 2018. In holding for Trulieve, Judge Karen Gievers ruled that the limit on the number of dispensary retail locations allowed per medical marijuana business licenses was unconstitutional. She struck down the entire 48-page law. In her opinion, she wrote that voters made clear in 2016 that the legislator was to have no role in implementing access to and availability of medical cannabis. In backing Trulieve, she asserted that the company is entitled to be registered and operate as many locations as it wishes, with no cap or ceiling. As predicted, the state did appeal the lower court decision, and on Monday, April 1st, state health officials dropped their appeal of Gievers' ruling, thus agreeing to allow Trulieve to open more dispensaries. Trulieve stock reacted well to the news, gaining around $2.50 this week. The State Office of Medical Marijuana Use Director Courtney Coppola and CEO of Trulieve Kim Rivers signed a settlement agreement this week. Under the agreement, Trulieve is allowed to have a total of 49 dispensaries, its 14 original dispensaries, plus the temporary cap of 35 included in the 2017 law before the cap goes away in 2020. If the appellate court grants the order to vacate Judge Gievers' order, Trulieve and not any of the other states' MMTCs would be allowed to have extra dispensaries, and all signs are pointing in the affirmative. Of the companies in Florida, Trulieve really has proven adept at negotiating the changing legal climate. Remember, Trulieve was the first MMTC in Florida, just first by itself. Then they were the first MMTC to offer smokable cannabis in March, just days after being permitted to. They have a very proactive legal team, they have a proactive CEO, and back in episode 2 we broke down how they got to sell smokable flower in the first place. So kudos to Trulieve for staying on top of their game. The other major lawsuit going on in the state of Florida is the Florigrown case. In this case, Florigrown was an MMTC applicant, and Florigrown is being represented by Ackerman, the largest law firm in Florida. They are challenging the MMTC cap, not the retail dispensary location cap, but the amount of MMTC's licenses the state can distribute. When we have movement on that story, I will gladly share it, but right now, it's dead in the water. Jeffrey Schreers has a great breakdown of the Trulieve lawsuit in the TC Palm this week. I'll have the article below in the show notes. Our last top story of the week comes out of Tallahassee, where hemp legislation continues to move through the legislature. Looking at a potentially lucrative new industry, lawmakers are working on rules for farmers and businesses to grow and sell industrial hemp in Florida. Now, in last week's episode, we broke down Senate Bill 1020, sponsored by Republican Senator Rob Bradley out of Fleming Island. The bill authorizes the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to administer a state hemp program. The senator modeled his bill after Kentucky's attempts to revitalize farmland once used to grow tobacco. Now, this week, we're bringing you an update with the House's version of the bill to create a state hemp program, and on Tuesday, the bill made it through its second of 3 committee stops. Representative Ralph Maluso sponsors HB 333, which passed unanimously in the last meeting of Agriculture and Natural Resources Subcommittee. His bill also authorizes the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to administer a state hemp program. Similar to SB 1020, it also sets up rulemaking and a board of experts to develop the system. Masulo said this week that he's heard from people both in the state and out of town who have shown interest in doing business in Florida. He went on to say that Florida has a unique advantage because of our climate and our tax structure. All signs are pointing that Florida will soon have a hemp program. A hemp program in Florida seems well liked by both the House and Senate. Samantha Gross has a great breakdown of this story on the Tampa Bay Times, and her article will be linked below in the show notes. And as a reminder, all of the news that we talk about every Friday on this podcast, we post and talk about throughout the week on our Twitter account, which is _FL Cannabis News. This week's patient count from Florida's Office of Medical Marijuana Use brings us to a total of 201,708 qualified patients. Now, it appears that the office releases their weekly update on Friday afternoons after we post our episodes. So what I'm going to do is continue to update you weekly on the patient count from last week, but I'll leave a link to their weekly update page in the show notes, so when you listen to the podcast, you can scroll down below and click and see their latest numbers. As of this recording, which I'm recording late on Thursday, we're at 201,708. MMTC's in the state at another 5 retail dispensary locations when we hit 300,000 qualified patients. Those are our top stories of the week. Let's move into upcoming events. We have 2 events this weekend. First, on Saturday, April 6th, we have the Cannabis and Hemp Career Symposium at the DoubleTree Hilton Hotel Airport from noon to 3 p.m. in Jacksonville. Hosted by the Southeast Cannabis Expo, Leafy Green Agency, and Cannabis Collective Media, this premier event will feature speakers with deep experience in and knowledge of the cannabis and hemp industries. The goal of this event is to bring people together to learn about careers in the cannabis space. The DoubleTree in Jacksonville is located at 2101 Dixie Clipper Drive, Jacksonville, Florida 32218. The event will run you $125 for full access. I'll have the RSVP link below in the show notes. Our last event of the week is on Sunday, April 7th in Gainesville. Green Carpet Marijuana Networking is hosting a networking event at Heartwood Soundgate, 619 South Main Street, Gainesville, Florida 32601. Green Carpet Networking is one of the elite networking communities in Florida for cannabis. As I mentioned before, I have been to a couple events. Tickets usually run to be about $50, $55, but if you're a patient, you get in for free. These Green Carpet Networking events are great because you meet people, learn more about the plant, eat good food, and drink. Again, this is in Gainesville on Sunday from noon to 4 p.m. It should be a great time. That's it for Florida's top cannabis news and events for this week. If you have any stories or events you'd like us to share, head on over to our Twitter account, _FL Cannabis News, or email us at floridacannabisnewspodcast@gmail.com. If you like our content, rate us 5 stars and leave a review on your podcast provider. Also subscribe so we can get these episodes delivered right into your podcast app. If you have a friend that you think might enjoy this content, share it. Thank you for staying up to date with Florida's cannabis industry. I'll be back with you again next Friday for another news-filled episode of Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. Have a great weekend.